Grown men shouldn't be wasting their lives playing video games.
Adults shouldn't be playing video games.
Nah, bro.
For some reason,
video games
I just
for
really
multiple
don't
hours
like the
every
idea
day.
of grown adults
men
playing
that
with
play
children.
video games.
Instead of
And
wasting
there's
some
sometimes
time
clear that
playing
when
toys,
the
now
money
it's
is
like
actual skills,
they should advocate.
As a grown adult, why are you playing video games? Don't you have goals?
Do achievements count? Oh hey, I unlocked one.
If you're someone who doom scrolls on social media, chances are you may have come across similar hot takes. Or even this one. If you play video games more than 2 to 3 hours a week, you're wasting your life. Oh yeah, it helps you relax. Congratulations, you're on the same spiritual level as a functional alcoholic.
Okay. What else do you want me to do then? Sit here and count the bumps on my ceiling? 1, 2...
It's no secret that back when gaming was in its infancy, video games were often marketed as something just for children to young teenagers, and it was very, very rare you'd have a game designed specifically for adults. But as time went on, more and more games began to contain mature themes, and today, the majority of them are usually rated 12 and up.
So then the question remains, are adults too old to play video games? No. I'm not here to tell you that those people were right. The answer is straight up no. Oh. I see we still have 18 minutes and 53 seconds left of the runtime. I guess I better explain further then.
Video games are heavily embedded in modern day culture now. You can play games on your PC, your console, your tablet, your phone, you can go out to arcades. Chances are most people have played a video game of some form in their life. Maybe even your grandmother, though it's probably just Candy Crush. There will always be exceptions to the rule, but the point is that it's never been easier to get into gaming. So why then, if it's so easily accessible, do people put an age limit on gaming as an activity, especially when we don't do it for other media? Nobody ever seems to say that you shouldn't be watching television after the age of 18, at least nowadays anyway, because the majority of us understand that, at the very least, it's a necessity to provide information to the public, whether direct via news sources or subliminal messaging via advertising or within television shows and film. Yet video games can be exactly the same as that. You'll have single-player campaigns that can itself tell a story with its own morals, sponsorships which advertise real-world products in a game, and multiplayer titles which can help bring out a sense of community in others. So at what point did people suddenly decide that video games weren't for grown adults anymore, especially when there are more adult gamers than children? Let's take a look at 4 distinct time periods to see exactly how audiences of different ages evolved with video games, and see if that argument even holds any merit. Before I begin, I should point out this video was written from a Western market perspective. It's likely video game markets around the world reacted differently to what I'll be discussing, but I just want you to bear this in mind going in. There are conflicting reports as to when the first video game was actually ever made, but one of the earliest known was Bertie the Brain, built in 1950 by Joseph Cates, which was an electronic version of tic-tac-toe. Curiously, at first, it wasn't initially designed for the entertainment of anybody, but was actually built to show off what an Adatron tube, also designed by Cates, could do for computing advancements, though eventually such tubes were deemed obsolete according to spacing.ca. However, the game was said to be a huge success amongst both children and adults for the 2 weeks it was shown at the Canadian National Exhibition. But another game I want to focus on more was Tennis for Two, made in 1958 by William Higginbotham. Now, similar to Bertie the Brain, it wasn't a game that was publicly distributed. It wasn't a game that was publicly distributed. It wasn't a game that was publicly distributed. Why can't I say it? It wasn't a game that was publicly distributed exactly, at least not yet or in this way, but a game that was built in a laboratory to also showcase at an exhibition. The basis of the game was simple. You had two controllers where the dial would control the ball's angle whilst the button next to it would hit the ball. And it played, well, like tennis. You had to avoid letting the ball hit the ground or even the net on your side. When it came to show the game at an exhibition at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in 1958, it drew in quite a large crowd. But most significantly, according to Higginbotham himself, it drew in more of the younger crowd. The high schoolers liked it best. You couldn't pull them away from it, as cited in the Replay, The History of Video Games book by Tristan Donovan. Unfortunately, after the exhibition, the game was dismantled and, for the most part, faded into obscurity. But in later years, a similar game would be distributed across the world as Pong. In this advert from 1976, it was dubbed as Family Fun.
For great family fun.
So not exclusively for kids, but also not just for adults, even though the advert does depict two adults playing it. So make of that what you will. Bit of a time jump, of course, but the 1980s and even some of the 1970s are probably the decades well known for popularising video games in the first place, and where a lot of nostalgia actually comes from. Those who are kids here are now, as of this video, in their late 30s to early 50s, and therefore got to see the evolution of gaming firsthand. During this time period, however, video games were often made for the entertainment of children and young teens, with video game arcades specifically built to allure them to malls. Many of the games at these arcades were what we would nowadays deem child-friendly, like Pac-Man, Q*bert, Paperboy, or Donkey Kong. But there were also games that, at the time, may have been deemed a little too violent or mature for kids, but acceptable for teenagers, like Street Fighter, Ninja Gaiden, or even Dragon's Lair. The mindset even extended into home consoles, with Ataris, Nintendo Entertainment Systems, and Sega Mega Drives, or Sega Genesis to you Americans, becoming the hottest Christmas gift amongst kids across the 1980s, even if there was a bit of a video game drought in the early 80s. This wasn't to say every video game released on those consoles were made for kids to play. One might argue Castle Wolfenstein, released in 1981, where you were killing without naming them, let's just say the very bad guys from the Second World War, I don't want to get this video demonetized, isn't exactly child-friendly. Even some years later, you had games like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1983, and whilst the graphics weren't inherently gory, it was based on a film franchise known for its intense horror. This was even the cover art. Back then, cover art had to do all the talking to sell a game, since there was no internet to see how the gameplay looked. So yeah, not for kids in the slightest, and it may have even been pushing it for early teens too. Suffice to say, around this time, whilst video games were mostly for kids, there was no harm in adults indulging either. At this point, video games were in a weird space. Whilst gaming as a hobby wasn't a horrendously unpopular pastime for many, they were sort of seen as some people view them nowadays. A kid's toy. Up until the early 1990s, video games didn't exactly depict gore super convincingly. As established earlier, there were attempts, but compared to what we have today, and even to what I'm about to talk about, they were tame. 1992 saw the release of Mortal Kombat, a 2D fighting game which, at first to the untrained eye, seemed like any other fighting game, until a player could defeat the other via graphical acts called fatalities, such as removing a character's head in a bloody fashion, or ripping someone's heart out. Shortly after, Night Trap released, which is essentially an interactive live-action movie, Whilst many horror movies had been released in the decades before, there had been rating systems in place since the 1960s to prevent children from being able to watch said graphical movies. Night Trap had somehow slipped through the cracks, as it was instead branded a video game, and therefore no rating was placed upon it at the time. And then after that, we of course had Doom. Need I say more? In a way, these three games changed the trajectory of video gaming as a whole, as it showed exactly what they could, and inevitably did, become. A panic then ensued amongst concerned parents and the government that children could get their hands on such violent games. And in the United States, after multiple hearings at the US Senate, the Entertainment Software Rating Board was formed, and required all video games to have an age rating placed on the packaging. This then essentially informed consumers what games were suitable for kids, teens, and adults. Now that ratings were established, and knowing full well that graphically gory titles seemed to sell, more and more mature themed video games were made, which saw titles such as Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, please remake this Capcom, I'm begging you, House of the Dead, and Silent Hill. At this point, it was clear. Video games weren't just for kids. There were obviously games built specifically for them, like Mario, Sonic, Rayman, Crash Bandicoot, and Pokemon, but developers could see a potential for selling to more mature markets. This only increased as we reached the 2000s, because at this point video games were going in a weird direction. You still had your kid-friendly games, but at this point developers were trying to appeal more to adults than they were to kids. And when I say adults, I actually mean older teenagers and adult men. If you've not watched it, I thoroughly recommend watching Kadikarus's video on the weird world of PlayStation magazines, as it goes through the weird history of what the late 1990s and 2000s were trying to push within its advertising, specifically in video game magazines, that being less of gore and more of sexually clad women. Sexy Lara Croft, booth babes at video game conventions, hot coffee, you get the point. But why was this becoming all the rage? Well, the kids who played video games a decade or so ago were now all grown up, and so they were putting away their consoles and getting out their... cars? What did adults even do for fun in the early 2000s? And whilst graphically violent video games were still a thing, most weren't selling bucket loads. But if there's one thing for certain, sex sells. And in fairness, it worked. Maybe a little too well, judging by the opinions of gamers today, but I won't go into that here. The Grand Theft Auto franchise is probably what most consider brought many adults back to gaming, which blended both sexual themes and violent gameplay into one. And for a brief time, San Andreas was even given the adults only rating by the ESRB after the hot coffee incident. For context, in short, the hot coffee incident was a hidden minigame in GTA San Andreas allowing the protagonist, CJ, to have intercourse with his girlfriend. When I say hidden, I mean it wasn't meant to be playable in the official game release, but via modding, it allowed you to play it. So now the industry was pushing games with more adult themes. You had horror titles, you had maturely rated action-adventure games, but there was one other genre which would eventually be dominated by many age groups, from little kids to middle-aged adults. The shooter, more specifically, Call of Duty. Before Call of Duty, the Halo franchise was the shooter which had garnered the most attention from adults. Whilst Call of Duty had been established as a franchise since 2003, it wasn't until 2007 when the fourth entry, Modern Warfare, was released that the shooter genre began to popularise to the extreme. Whilst the game was made for adults and even rated as such, for some strange reason it appealed to kids as well. Back when Modern Warfare was all the rage, I was in my early teenage years, and I guess the reason it appealed to me, and it sounds so simple, was how cool it looked. The gameplay loop was also very addicting. There's a reason why these earlier titles got high reviews. My only other assumption would be that grown men playing shooters had their own kids as well, and those same kids were being exposed to these games at such a young age. Kind of like when a parent gets their kid into football. Chances are they're going to imitate some of their parents' interests. So as we reach the end of the 2000s, video game audiences at this point were a bit all over the place. Kids had their own games, sure, but were also playing titles not made for them. As for the adults, they had been brought back into the fold, with no signs of quitting. This remains true even today, but that's not to say that things didn't continue to change. I'm not saying across the 2010s the industry had run out of ideas for video games, but let's just say it relied heavily on nostalgia to both bring old audiences back and generate new ones. Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Shadow of the Colossus, Pokemon, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Halo, Ratchet & Clank, and Doom, just to name a few. And if there was one way to make money, it was through nostalgia, bringing back the audiences who grew up with those franchises. Some of these franchises weren't even adult themed, like Pokemon and Crash Bandicoot, and although normally built for younger audiences, they appeal to adults as well. That's not to say games built for younger to teen audiences didn't contain adult ideas. A lot of the messaging in such games can be catered to both audiences, for kids to ensure they don't repeat past mistakes of their ancestors, and for adults to convince them to stop any wrong things they might be doing now in their life. And I think this is partly why, to bring this video full circle, there are people out there who claim video games are just for children. Because the industry is a mixed bag of all types of genres now that it's hard to distinguish who is the intended target audience for various games anymore. At the same time, societal pressures and the rise of social media has warped the perception of what should and shouldn't be enjoyed by a person. Why are you sitting there playing a video game instead of making money for that house you'll never be able to afford because wages are low and inflation is at an all-time high? But at the end of the day, why should it matter what an adult enjoys as their hobby or pastime? The funny thing is, the people who talk so much hate towards video games are often people who have their own similar pastimes, like sports. And I don't mean playing sports, I just mean watching. For the record, I'm not hating on it, but sport is something most people just watch without much of their own interactions. At least with playing video games, you're actively participating in your interest, creating your own goals and achievements, going on a variety of adventures to places that could never exist in real life, and in some aspects, learning. And if you're not feeling up for participating in playing a sport, then there's probably a video game equivalent to play instead. Just because you don't like an activity doesn't mean another person should dislike it as well. Could you imagine if everybody was the same person and had the same activities? It would be like that Fairly Odd Parents episode, and what a hell that would be. As I said at the start of this video, games have become so accessible and varied in genre that I would be shocked if you, the person watching this video, haven't played a game before at least once in your life, whether it be on your mobile, tablet, arcade, home console, or PC. A lot of parents have kids who also play video games. So is it to say that a parent who would apparently be too old to play video games aren't allowed to enjoy them with their own children? Or is that the only exception to the rules to these people who say this? Because if so, why? As long as the activity is legal, why does it matter how an adult spends their free time? Especially when there are video games built specifically for adults. Could you imagine trying to make gaming illegal for anyone above the age of 18 now? The industry would die within weeks. And maybe that's what those who say things like this would want. But then we'd just be left with all these games that no adult would be allowed to play. And if you're someone who says video games are only for kids, are you telling me you would let your child play this? And this? And this? And this? And this! allow me to be clear. Video games are for fucking everybody.